In 1942, a dying woman was given the rarest substance on Earth, rarer than gold. It started as an accident, a mistake nobody wanted. Mold in a forgotten petri dish. For over a decade, the world ignored it. Then, a war made it impossible to ignore. This is the story of how a battlefield wound accidentally saved millions of lives.
The battlefield wound that accidentally saved millions in the summer of 1942, a hospital in New Haven, Connecticut, was watching a young woman die. Her name was Ann Miller. She was 33 years old, married, expecting a child in a few months. A miscarriage had left her with a raging bloodstream infection, streptococcal sepsis. Her temperature spiked past 106 degrees. Blood transfusions failed. Sulfa drugs, the best medicine of the era, did nothing. Doctors had run out of options. She was, by every measure available in 1942, a dying woman. Then, a doctor did something that had never been done before in the United States. He injected her with 5.5 grams of a brown, crusty, barely purified substance flown in under police escort from a small pharmaceutical lab. It was, at that moment, one of the rarest substances on Earth, rarer, gram for gram, than gold. By the next morning, her fever had broken. That substance was penicillin. And the story of how it went from a moldy laboratory accident to a drug pouring by the billions of doses into the bloodstreams of soldiers on D-Day is not really a story about medicine. It's a story about war, about how the sheer, grinding, industrial-scale slaughter of the Second World War created a problem so large that only a wartime economy could solve it. And in solving it, accidentally rebuilt modern medicine forever. This is that story. Let's go back further first. To 1928 and a cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Alexander Fleming was not a tidy man. He was, by the accounts of everyone who worked with him, a brilliant but chaotic bacteriologist who let petri dishes of Staphylococcus bacteria pile up on his bench for weeks before cleaning them. In September of that year, he came back from a month-long family holiday to find his usual mess waiting for him. And in one of those forgotten dishes, something strange had happened. A blob of blue-green mold had drifted in, probably from a lab downstairs, possibly through an open window, and around that mold was a clear ring, a dead zone. Wherever the mold sat, the bacteria simply refused to grow. Fleming was curious enough to investigate. He identified the mold as a strain of Penicillin, and he found that whatever it was secreting could kill a startling range of dangerous bacteria without harming human tissue in a test tube. He published his findings in 1929. He even coined the name penicillin. And then almost nothing happened. This is the part of the story people tend to skip because it's inconvenient for the neat narrative of scientific genius. Fleming's discovery sat mostly ignored for over a decade. The problem wasn't the idea. The problem was the substance itself. Penicillin, as Fleming had it, was a thin, unstable broth. It broke down quickly. Growing enough of the mold to produce a meaningful, purified quantity of the drug was, with the technology of the 1930s, a monumental and unglamorous chemistry problem, the kind that attracts almost no funding and even less enthusiasm. Fleming himself tried and largely gave up on purifying it into something you could actually inject into a patient. For over 10 years, penicillin was a laboratory curiosity, a paragraph in a handful of journals, gathering dust. It took a war to change that. By the late 1930s, a very different kind of researcher picked the idea back up. Howard Florey, an Australian pharmacologist running the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford, and Ernst, a German-Jewish biochemist who had fled Nazi Germany a few years earlier. Alongside them worked a quiet, extraordinarily resourceful scientist named Norman Heatley, whose name history has been far too stingy with. By 1940, the team had managed to produce a small, more stable, more purified batch of penicillin, and they tested it on 8 mice infected with a lethal dose of streptococcus. 4 mice got the drug. 4 didn't. By the next morning, the untreated mice were dead. The treated ones survived. It was proof of concept. But mice need milligrams. People need grams. And the war made that gap catastrophic. Britain in 1940 was under aerial bombardment, its factories geared entirely toward tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Its chemical industry stretched to breaking point, producing conventional wartime materials. There was no capacity, no glassware, no staff, and frankly no spare national attention to build the kind of industrial fermentation operation that mass-producing a fungal metabolite would require. Florey's own lab took to growing the mold in whatever containers they could scavenge: bedpans, biscuit tins, ceramic vessels custom-made by a local pottery, even hospital bottles, because normal laboratory glassware couldn't be spared or produced fast enough. Heatley, in one of the great unsung feats of wartime improvisation, personally designed the extraction apparatus that pulled usable penicillin out of the mold broth, using recycled bedpans as vats and a system of pumps built from doorbells and biscuit tins. This was Nobel Prize caliber science, being conducted with the equipment of a school chemistry set. The first human trial in Britain, in February 1941, involved a policeman named Albert Alexander, who had a small scratch from a rose thorn that had spiraled into a horrific, disfiguring infection covering his face and scalp. He was given the tiny stockpile of penicillin the Oxford team possessed. He began to recover dramatically until the drug ran out. The team was so desperate for more that they extracted unmetabolized penicillin from his own urine to redose him. It wasn't enough. He relapsed and died. That single case told the Oxford team everything they needed to know. In the cruelest way possible, the science worked. The scale did not exist. And in the middle of a war, scale was the only thing that mattered. Florey understood that Britain, under bombardment and drained of industrial capacity, could not build what was needed. So in the summer of 1941, he and Heatley flew to the United States, not yet at war, carrying with them a small supply of mold culture, some of it reportedly smeared into the linings of their coats in case their luggage was lost. A detail that captures just how thin the margin for this entire project really was. They ended up at the USDA's Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, a facility that, of all things, specialized in agricultural fermentation, because it worked with corn steep liquor, a waste byproduct of corn processing. It turned out that corn steep liquor was an extraordinary growth medium for Penicillium mold, dramatically boosting the yield of penicillin the mold produced. This was a discovery driven entirely by American industrial agriculture bumping into British medical desperation, and it changed everything downstream. Then came the second leap. A USDA scientist named Mary Hunt, nicknamed Moldy Mary by her colleagues, was tasked with scouring local markets for better mold strains. She found a moldy cantaloupe at a Peoria fruit market that carried a strain of Penicillium, producing far more penicillin than Fleming's original strain ever had. That single cantaloupe's mold, after further refinement through X-ray and ultraviolet mutation techniques, became the ancestor strain used in nearly all industrial penicillin production for years afterward. A war-driven science project had now been solved, in part by a piece of spoiled fruit. Now here is where the war itself becomes the main character. By 1942 and 1943, American and British military planners were doing brutal arithmetic. Wound infection, not the wounds themselves, was one of the single largest killers of otherwise survivable combat injuries. Battlefield medicine in the early 20th century had improved surgery, improved transport of the wounded, improved blood transfusion. But bacterial infection following battlefield wounds, gangrene, sepsis, infected shrapnel wounds, burns still killed soldiers who had, by all rights, survived the initial injury. There was also a second, less discussed but militarily enormous problem: gonorrhea, and other bacterial venereal infections were sidelining enormous numbers of active duty troops at any given time, removing soldiers from combat readiness for weeks. Military medical planners were bluntly aware that a drug that could cure these infections in days rather than weeks was in effect a force multiplier. It meant more able-bodied soldiers available for deployment at any given moment. Put simply, penicillin wasn't just a humanitarian medical breakthrough to the war planners of 1943. It was viewed, with cold operational logic, as war material as strategically essential as fuel, ammunition, or steel. And when the U.S. War Production Board treats a fungus as a strategic resource, extraordinary things start to happen. The United States government, through the War Production Board, essentially ordered its pharmaceutical industry, Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, and others to cooperate on solving the production problem, sharing research that competing companies would normally have guarded jealously. This was almost unheard of in a capitalist pharmaceutical industry. Patents were set aside. Rivals shared fermentation data. The government coordinated it like the industrial mobilization. It was comparable in spirit, if not in scale, to the mobilization behind the atomic bomb happening at the very same time, just with far less secrecy and infinitely more publicity. The real production miracle, though, wasn't biological. It was industrial engineering. Growing penicillium mold on the surface of a liquid in shallow trays, the method Florey's team had been using, was painfully slow and produced tiny yields relative to the labor and space required. Pfizer chemists and engineers pioneered a technique called deep tank fermentation, submerging the mold in huge aerated vats, pumping oxygen through thousands of gallons of nutrient broth continuously, essentially turning an artisanal mold growing process into something resembling brewery-scale industrial fermentation. Pfizer converted an ice plant in Brooklyn into one of the first deep-tank penicillin production facilities, running fermentation tanks around the clock. The technique that had made mass beer and citric acid production possible in America was repurposed to farm a life-saving mold by the thousands of gallons. The results were staggering. In 1943, American production of penicillin stood at roughly 21 billion units for the entire year. In 1944, it was around 1.7 trillion units. By 1945, over 6.8 trillion units. Costs collapsed just as dramatically. A treatment that cost roughly $20 per dose in 1943 fell to just a few cents per dose by the war's end. This is, by any measure, one of the fastest scale-ups of a complex biological product in industrial history, and it happened in about 3 years, in the middle of a global war, using wartime priority allocation of steel, glass, and labor that would have been unthinkable for a civilian pharmaceutical project in peacetime. By June 1944, D-Day penicillin production had scaled enough that Allied medical planners could stockpile it for the invasion of Normandy. Military doctors carried penicillin ashore, and field hospitals used it on wounded soldiers within days of the landings. Soldiers who, a war earlier, would have died slowly of infected wounds in the weeks after survivable combat trauma were instead treated, in some cases within hours of injury. This wasn't universally smooth. Supply was still tightly rationed early on, and there are documented internal debates among military doctors over whether to prioritize penicillin for combat wounds or for venereal disease cases, given how scarce the drug still was in 1943 and early 1944. But by the time of the Normandy campaign and the push across Europe, penicillin had gone from an experimental rarity flown in under armed guard for a single dying patient in Connecticut to a standard-issue battlefield medicine distributed by the crate. By the war's end, historians and military medical records credit penicillin with saving the lives of a very large number of Allied soldiers who would otherwise have died of infected wounds. Precise figures vary by source and are still debated by historians, but the consensus is that it fundamentally altered survival rates for infected battlefield injuries in a way no drug ever had before. Here's the twist, and it's really the heart of why this story matters beyond the war itself. The industrial infrastructure built to solve a military supply problem, the deep tank fermentation plants, the improved mold strains, the manufacturing know-how, the government-industry cooperation model didn't disappear when the war ended. It became the foundation of the entire post-war antibiotics industry. Once the war-driven urgency to arm soldiers against infection had built this capacity, that same capacity turned outward, toward civilian medicine, almost overnight. Diseases that had been essentially untreatable and often lethal: bacterial pneumonia, diphtheria, syphilis, childhood ear infections that could spread into fatal sepsis, women dying of postpartum infection, exactly like Ann Miller, nearly had become, within a few short years, treatable with a course of pills or an injection. The mortality curves for a whole category of bacterial disease bent downward, permanently, starting almost immediately after 1945. It's genuinely difficult to put a single number on how many lives penicillin and the entire antibiotic era it launched has saved in the 8 decades since. Estimates from public health historians run into the tens of millions at minimum, likely far higher when you account for every related antibiotic that followed penicillin's production model. What's not difficult to establish is the direct causal chain. A moldy petri dish forgotten by an untidy Scottish bacteriologist in 1928, sitting inert and unfunded for over a decade, was only turned into a usable, mass-produced, civilization-altering drug because a war made mass infection among wounded soldiers an urgent, well-funded, national security-level problem. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the 1945 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery. But if you're looking for the true origin of penicillin, as we know it, not the discovery, but the drug, you have to look past the 3 Nobel laureates. You have to look at Norman Heatley building extraction rigs out of doorbells and bedpans, at Mary Hunt scouring a Peoria fruit market for a moldy cantaloupe, at Pfizer engineers adapting brewery tanks to farm fungus by the thousands of gallons, and at the terrible, simple arithmetic of a world war where the number of soldiers dying from infected wounds became too large for any government to ignore. Ann Miller, the woman who nearly died in New Haven in 1942, lived to be 90 years old. She died in 1999, one of the very first people saved by mass-produced penicillin and one of hundreds of millions who would follow her. The wound didn't save millions. The war around it did, by turning a forgotten mold into an industrial imperative, and in doing so, handing the 20th century one of its greatest, strangest gifts, a medicine born not in spite of war, but because of it.